us tonight. We are grateful to the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities and the Cambridge Heritage Research Centre for their support of this group and for making this event possible. The ISDG is a graduate student-led initiative started in 2019 with the objectives of promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge and promoting the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. Tonight's panel discussion is on the topic of the present and future of community-based research. The panel seeks to cover the pros and cons of this approach, explore how relationships between community and researchers have changed, and hear from the mouths of stakeholders and researchers involved in communities and research about them. Often community research is perceived through a utilitarian lens and taken for granted, with important questions of effective practice or even the legitimacy of some practices left unasked and unanswered. We want to engage with those questions here today. My name is Layo. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Department of Sociology. I'm a Sarawakian Dayak of Iban and Kainkinya descent. My research topic is on queer and Indigenous approaches to time and temporality, using my homeland of Malaysian Borneo as a site of study. My work is largely autoethnographic, although collaborative methods form a significant part of my research strategy. I will be the moderator for this event. Tonight, we are joined by a distinguished panel of speakers from a diversity of disciplines and geographies. We'll be hearing from Jacqueline, Thressia Octaviani, and Helen Alderson, as well as myself. The format for this event will be a semi-structured panel discussion surrounding issues related to community-based research. The speakers of this panel consist of both insiders and outsiders to the communities they research, who will be sharing their various perspectives on the topic in the hopes that this could further elucidate the way we may approach and understand community-based research from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. After the main panel discussion, there will be an audience Q&A session. But before I introduce our speakers, there are just a few housekeeping points. Please keep your microphone turned off. The event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to be recorded. The recording will be available on the CRASSH website and on the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel soon after the event. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat or to me, and we will read it aloud. If you would like your question to remain anonymous, please indicate that along with your question in a message directly to me. If you want to ask your question in person, please indicate that in the chat and we will unmute you. Captioning has been enabled for this event. If you would like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note the captions are provided by Zoom and CRASSH cannot be held responsible for the accuracy. Rest assured, you will be able to revisit the event recording on YouTube. We are doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event. It goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and each other throughout the event. So let me introduce our speakers on tonight's panel. Jacqueline Paul is a researcher at Ngavaya Titui Māori and Indigenous Research Centre and lecturer at the School of Architecture in Landscape Architecture at Unitec Institute of Technology. She has recently completed an MPhil in Planning, Growth and Regeneration in the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge, and she'll be beginning her PhD at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the fall at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. She is also an expert and technical advisor for the Human Rights Commission, an independent specialist for the Urban Development and Planning Committee at Kaingaora, Homes and Communities Housing New Zealand, a member of the expert advisory panel for Te Kawa Mataho Public Service Commission, supporting open government, and has also been involved with the National Science Challenge, building better homes, towns, and cities through Māori housing research. Thressia Andriati Octaviani Dading, or Ovi, is a fourth-year PhD student in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Her research follows informal youth collectives on Sumba Island, Indonesia, in relation to the increasing trend of traditional inspired production and consumption. She's interested in looking at the strategies of reflexivity, objectification, circulation, inflation, and normalization of cultures. She carried out her fieldwork on Sumba Island between mid-2019 to the end of 2020. She's currently writing up a dissertation, which is due in 5 months. Helen Alderson is Pākehā of European descent, archaeologist from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is based in Cambridge. Helen has been fortunate to learn and work alongside community members from Moana, Oceania. Helen is most interested in archaeological studies of ethnographic museum collections and how these taonga treasures can be linked with the artisans who fashioned them and their original landscapes. And I've already introduced myself before. So with that in mind, let's begin the panel discussion. So I would first like to ask each of our panel speakers how you all came into your research. And I can start us off with this question. So I came about my research, my topic on time through my undergraduate dissertation, which was originally on queer migrations and identity, and time and temporality just happened to be a prominent aspect of my data analysis. But for most of my work, I am motivated by personal experience, which sort of informed my stance as an autoethnographer. And so a lot of what I do is me trying to attempt to articulate my experience and understand it. And by extension of that, trying to understand the experience of others like me, which sort of then pushed me into kind of a community based or community focused or centered research strategy. And also queer Indigenous Malaysians are fairly underrepresented in academia. And so a lot of my work is trying to give voice to people in my community and in my demographic. So who else would like to answer this question? Let's start with Helen. How did you come into your research?
Okay, well, I started off actually in classical studies, of all things, and I had a deep interest in archaeology. And in New Zealand, the big focus of archaeology is Moana, Oceania. And I rapidly realized that this was an incredibly exciting and interesting place in which to work. And so from there, every research sort of project that I've done has been built on relationships, you know, sort of friendships and academic collaborations and things with other people. So I've been really fortunate to sort of go to sort of Vanuatu and Hawaii and Aotearoa, New Zealand and Micronesia from those sort of, based in that sort of relationships and things. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jacqueline, would you like to answer?
Kia ora, Ash, and firstly, thank you for opening us up and having us for this session. I was just quickly reflecting on the journey, and so for those who aren't so familiar with the housing context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and so as mentioned, I'm Indigenous to New Zealand, and we have such a significant housing crisis and one of the most pressing issues in Aotearoa. And so earlier, I guess maybe like 5 years ago is kind of when I started doing research, and really because my background was in landscape architecture at the time, and for those who are quite engaged in urban studies and planning, and even from an Indigenous context, just the highly colonized spaces and places that we live in, and especially within the built environment. And I really found it quite troubling that a lot of the places I did not recognize my own face, and my own identity within our environment. But actually it was a significant proportion of those experiencing homelessness were Māori. And for me, that was quite problematic. And so as opposed to the places in the environment in which we are, Indigenous to, why are we homeless on our own lands, And so it was through, that kind of interest in terms of, okay, what is my role and responsibility through research to contribute to ensuring we're addressing such inequities? And so I guess that was kind of the early stage in terms of like in academia and understanding the opportunity where research is a vehicle to start, contributing to that limited body of knowledge. And at that time, I was quite young, I would say, and actually a high proportion of those experiencing homelessness were under 25, even more so. So as a young person, it was a lot of familiarity, and I have such a huge privilege to be able to have access to resources, and knowledge that many don't. So what are we doing, or what am I doing, and what is my role and responsibility to contributing to that? So I guess that was earlier in my career, just around sowing the seed from planting the seed. And so since then, a high proportion of my work is in Māori housing and large-scale urban development, both in public and public sphere and in the Māori sphere more so. And how do I understand the kind of system and the way in which it functions and affects our lives? So yeah, that's kind of just a short kind of overview in terms of my role within research.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And Ovi, last but not least.
So my master's degree was concentrated in urban anthropology. And I got interested in urban anthropology because, people living in urban area are urban area consisted of a lot of people from different backgrounds. And I've always been interested in religious tolerance and cosmopolitanism. And whilst I was in between my master's degree and my PhD, I was searching for something that is related to urban phenomenon, but in Eastern Indonesia. So my paternal family comes from East Indonesia, but I realized that I had not known anything about it. So I really wanted to go to East Indonesia and to learn more about it. And then so in 2015, 1 year after my graduations from my master's degree, I went to Sumba Island for the first time. And there I encountered people and especially young people who are very interested in their own culture and learning about their own cultures and traditions after being marginalized for many years. And I see this trend increasingly as well in other parts in Indonesia, for example, like going local, respecting your ancestors and etc. And also not only in Indonesia, but also internationally in other continents as well. So I think this is a very interesting phenomena to research, and then I just go for it and I follow these youth collectives that I encountered in my trip in 2015.
Thank you, Ovi. So yeah, I guess this leads us to our next question. What does community-based research mean in your discipline, and what makes your method communal? Who would like to start us off with that discussion? Let's start with, I see you smiling there, Helen. I feel like you want to say something.
With archaeology, I just want to preface that archaeology is an enormously varied discipline. And so what I'm about to say is only my perspective, and it's a very sort of narrow perspective of how I'm sort of going to say what I'm saying. So for me, community-based research means, in many cases, a deep engagement with the people whose archaeology you are looking at. It often means living with people in a community for a long period of time. It often means working with them on a field site alongside them. In many cases, it means publishing with them if that's what they're interested in, or in developing sort of other joint projects. I think the exciting thing about community-based research in Moana Oceania is that it's moving towards community-driven questions as well. So instead of somebody coming in with an outside question, which I have done before, there's an exciting movement more towards doing what the community is interested in and what will benefit them. So that's an incredibly narrow perspective. I don't want to say that's what it is in every archaeological context, because it absolutely isn't. But that's an exciting little chunk that I think is happening in Moana Oceania at the moment.
I find that so fascinating because I have very little contact with archaeology. And I think for people like Ovi and I, we're so when you think of sociology and anthropology, you immediately think about social relationships and communities and stuff like that. These disciplines are very much built for community-based research, And so oftentimes, when I think of archaeology, you have that very stereotypical image of Indiana Jones, in an uncharted, exploring a temple or something. And you don't oftentimes think of archaeologists as people who work with other people. But then when you really think about it, like, you know, when you think of things like artifacts and objects, those are very communal things, you know, and that's a very interesting perspective there. Does anybody else want to add to that? Ovi, do you have something you'd like to add? I feel like, yeah, I feel like as an anthropologist, like you have a lot to say, you know, when it comes to like community-based stuff.
Okay, so in my opinion, as a very new anthropologist, as an anthropologist in training, I think all of social science data comes from people, and usually the study of social science is demarcated in a community, in which the basic forms of community, I think, are relations between humans. And I think one of the social science objectives is to understand these relations and the structures. And for anthropology itself, I think most of the people already know that anthropology is known as a discipline whose research method or ethnography is described as researching whilst living in the community. But of course, there are many non-anthropologists or non-anthropology discipline who use ethnography as well, so it's not very exclusive to anthropology. And I think the aspiration of the discipline and the methodology of anthropology is long-time immersion into the local community. So the aspiration is until the researcher is no longer visible and blend in with the local people. And I see in many writings of social anthropologists, they really write down these things in their papers, that they really note their transformations from guest to host, from the one who served tea to the ones making the tea. Like, for example, Valerio Valeri, an anthropologist, but he already passed away. In his book, The Forest of Taboo, about his ethnography on an island in eastern Indonesia, he told a story when he and his wife, also an anthropologist, were no longer considered as guests in the village. And then less and less people asked them to eat in people's houses. And then Valerio Valeri and his wife watched with envy, like new village guests greeted enthusiastically by the villagers. But we all know that this aspiration is, you know, very difficult to achieve, right? I mean, I think it's also far-fetched. I think researchers will always be visible in the community, and I think it is for the better, because, you know, the distancing, you know, it's about consent. It's about, you know, to be responsible that you are doing something, because researchers are not hidden CCTVs. I hope not. So I think detachment and visibility is also important while trying to blend in with the community. So going back to the question, I think what makes anthropology is community-based is basically because the data comes from the community and you live with the community and you try to be the community, one of the community-based, I think.
That's so fascinating that you brought up ethnography, because a lot of my work is autoethnographic, and sociology it's a very interesting discipline, because it, methodologically speaking, you can kind of do whatever, right? Like traditionally, sociology has often been cited as this very like structural, like methodical type of discipline, where it's like it's stats and like surveys and data and stuff like that. But that's sort of changing, you know, and especially when it comes to like qualitative data, things like interviews, ethnography, that's really sort of changing the way we kind of think about social relationships. And as an autoethnographer, I often feel as though like my research is very self-centered. It's very like, how do I feel? What is my experience? How am I going to articulate this very specific thing that happened to me, and how do I like connect that to like broader social issues? But what I found so fascinating reading more about autoethnography is how actually collaborative it is. So many, I can't think of their names on the top of my head, but a lot of autoethnographers have written about the importance of making sure that whatever you're writing about in terms of like in relation to your own experience has to sort of be in conjunction with other people's stories, other people's narratives, always sort of checking in with like like checking in with like other people who are like who have gone through or experienced things that are similar to you, right? And you know, and often autoethnography gets a lot of flack for being this very self-centered method, but it can be collaborative and it can be communal if you know what you're doing, right? And especially I'm going back to like Indigenous research strategies, thinking about the idea of witnessing, right? Like letting people in to your stories, into your life, allowing people to witness your own narratives, your own experiences. That's sort of what makes it communal, right? I could write pages and pages and pages, I could write like an autobiography about my life, but at the end of the day, if I don't bring it to other people, what does that mean? You know? And so that's sort of like my challenge as an autoethnographer, is to always make sure that my stories sort of exist in relation to other people, which is kind of like what I'm excited about with my research. For context, I haven't started my research yet. I am a first year PhD student, so I've yet to pass my upgrade report. But that's sort of what I'm excited about, is finding ways to make autoethnography communal and collaborative, and sort of the challenges that come with that. Jacqueline, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was thinking about, obviously, the high proportion of work that I do is kaupapa Māori based research. And so I'm thinking about, obviously, this framework around community-based participatory research as the kind of, you know, equivalent Western framework. And then us in the way in which we kind of engage in research by adopting, right, a very Māori-centric. So kaupapa Māori theory, for those who aren't so familiar, is by Māori, for Māori, with Māori, essentially. And that's just how it is, right, in terms of who we work with, who we are as a people, and the research that we're engaged in. So there are different kind of processes, and I know you've spoken about, you know, the relationships, right, as part of it, in terms of the different kind of concepts in which we engage in. So in Te Ao Māori, or in the Māori worldview, really understanding this concept of whanaungatanga. And for those who are quite familiar, you know, the Māori community is quite small. And what tends to happen, you're either related or you know somebody, or, you know, it's quite close knitted as well. And there's actually not many Māori researchers. So everyone tends to be able to work with each other in many different spheres. And what I find quite interesting in terms of even just the question you've asked around, you know, what does community-based research mean in your discipline? So my background is in landscape architecture and planning. And as opposed to what does it mean in the discipline, it's actually, is the discipline going to catch up with actually understanding and engaging with kaupapa Māori theory? Because the reality is it's not. It's very far behind both, well, in my opinion, in both the architecture and planning field, right? It's still quite novel. How do we interpret, how do we work with communities through this kind of design process, essentially, or planning process, to engage with these kind of communities in which we're supposed to serve? So firstly, to preface, I believe that our disciplines are still quite far behind, but I think we're kind of in an interesting moment where we're starting to engage essentially with, you know, emerging practitioners and professionals around educating what does that mean within our field to engage with tribal groups, right? What is our role and responsibility as practitioners and professionals to engage in treaty relationships? So because the context in which we operate in is quite unique, there's quite a lot of cultural obligations and responsibilities as well. So that's really different. The same within the planning process, how we're engaging with Māori, and given that, again, the unique context that we work in, what is our, you know, how are we engaging? How are they, you know, formulating policy, implementing, delivering, right through to resourcing as well, really being transparent about that process. So the disciplines need to be able to catch up, and they really need to kind of engage and understand this, you know, this kaupapa Māori theory and the interpretation of what it means in the discipline. But within just, you know, research generally, it's consistent, and it's still the same within kaupapa Māori theory. And so there are, you know, unique methods where it's really anchored in our own values and principles and the way in which we work and serve our communities, essentially. And I love how you were speaking about, you know, this kind of whole process of storytelling, which is our equivalent to pūrākau. And who are the owners of those stories, right? Whose right is it to tell those stories? And being really clear about that as well is really important. There are other kind of customary practices and processes in which we work with our people as well, and ensuring that that is fundamental to this working relationship, because it's not a beginning and an end. It's about those, the longevity of those relationships, and you can't run away and kind of in Māoridom, because someone either knows your auntie and uncle or your cousin or your parents as well. So, those are really critical and fundamental to the way in which we work. So, yeah, I guess that's kind of just a quick, brief overview in terms of not only just what that means within the spheres that we work in, but also how far behind sometimes our disciplines are, and that it's not confined to just the discipline. How are we working interdisciplinary, and what are those kind of common values and principles that we share in order to kind of, get the best outcomes? So yeah, hopefully that's as simple as I can possibly make it.
I'm so glad you brought up the thing about disciplines, because sociology, I feel like things are progressing, but it's sort of yet to sort of hit that decolonial turn that sort of other disciplines like anthropology, for example, have sort of started doing like way before we have. And when you think of sociology, you don't think of Indigenous studies, you don't think of Indigenous scholarship, which is a shame, because you could really learn so much about how to conduct social research from these scholars, from these thinkers, because like, as sociologists, our job is to study social relationships. And I've learned so much from like my readings in like Indigenous scholarship and stuff like that, on like what it means to put the community first. What does it mean to put communal relationships above everything else, including your findings and stuff like that. And it's sort of like, it sort of forces you to reflect, I guess, ethically as well, on your own work, which I'm so grateful for. And, these are things that, like, even though I am an Indigenous person, these are things that I've yet to like, sort of like I've always had them in the back of my head, but I've never had it articulated to me before I like started reading these texts, which I feel like don't get enough recognition in social science, like more generally. Yeah, so I guess like moving on to our next question, I actually wanted to ask specifically Helen and Ovi, as outsider researchers, what strategies do you use to maintain critical reflexivity and sort of like, I guess for lack of better phrasing, mitigate bias in the field when you come in and like conduct research with these communities? Who would like to start first? Ovi, maybe? Or Helen? Do you want to say them? Yes.
Okay. It's a very awkward position to be in. And so I should also probably just say what it is I actually do. So I've looked at archaeological sort of sites and things from across time and space, but at the moment I've really sort of gotten super interested in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Ovi, I think, mentioned cosmopolitanism. I'm super interested in that from a sort of Nicholas Thomas perspective in the Pacific. So I sort of look at the sort of deep interactions between people sort of over time in those periods. There are several things that I try to do, but I can never fully mitigate the bias. So I have to be really honest about it. And I've now tried to move towards, in each thing I'm writing, talking about my own bias in a way that an anthropologist might. But one of the things that I would say is I want, it's important to talk to the community and about your own bias and about how you're perceived. It's also important to really read up on Indigenous scholarship. There's the most amazing plethora of Indigenous scholarship coming out of Oceania at the moment. And some of it has sort of theoretical implications that are far more important than what archaeologists have until now been sort of using. In many cases, I think I have, and sometimes others have been using the wrong sort of tools to be looking at things. And then also I try to write reflexive field journals when I'm in the field. So there's a range of different strategies that I use, but I can never fully mitigate the bias. And I want to be really, really clear about that. This is why community-based research is so important. Yeah.
Ovi, do you want to add anything to that?
About insider, outsider.
As an
Sumba,
outsider. Yeah.
As an outsider.
Yeah.
So Sumba is in Indonesia, right? So in a way, I'm an insider in a way, but also an outsider because I was born and raised in Jakarta, from Java Island, which is like people say it's the central of Indonesia because the capital is there. But then my paternal family comes from Eastern Indonesia, from an island which is like a part of the same province, like Sumba Island, for example. And it's very interesting, you know, going to Sumba. People always thought that I am a Javanese. People never thought I'm Eastern Indonesian as well. But I think it's very productive in each encounters when there is a misunderstanding. It becomes very, very productive. Like, for example, many Sumbanese, they can speak Javanese because many of them went to school on Java Island or Bali or Timor Island, because there's only one university on Sumba Island. And they are very proud of being able to speak Javanese language, because Javanese people, not all of them can speak Sumbanese language, you know? So, and then I just realized that it's not that I just realized, I mean, I wrote this down in my proposal. I want to represent Sumba Island as something that is very cosmopolitan, like what Helen said. I mean, Pacific Islands are very cosmopolitan since a long time. And on Sumba Island, there are people from Sabu and then from other islands around Indonesia. So in a way, each of those people are also insider and outsider at the same time. So I think this can help us to rethink what indigenous means as well. And especially in Indonesia, when it's very diverse. Meanwhile, internationally, perhaps in heritage study side, perhaps this is already evolving, but you know, we see indigeneity as something that is pure or bounded or something like that. So my research, one of the aim of my research is to show that what you mean by indigenous is very troubling, you know, and then there have been cosmopolitan since a long time. There's exchanges of ideas, and like what Helen said as well, I also encountered that in my research. For example, my interlocutors are very super reflexive about the body of works that Sumbanese academicians have worked on Sumba Island itself. And I think they also taught me a lot about it. And in a way, I think positions are also very fluid. Like, although I come from like Cambridge, from the western side of the globe, depends where you see that from. But there are many foreigners on Sumba Island, like Americans and Australians, who have lived on the island longer than me, and they're more local than me. So, you know, what do you mean by local? What do you mean by insiders? Is it like your skin color, or how long have you stayed on the island? I think it has to be discussed as well. And one of my close friends is an Australian who married a Sumbanese man, and now she lives on Sumba Island, and she's been there for maybe 10 years, and now she has a renewable energy company. So it's very interesting to see on the field. Actually, I experienced that power and also relations are very fluid, and I learn every minute of it from what's happening on the field. Yeah.
I'm so glad you sort of mentioned that whole, like, the vagueness of what does it mean to be an outsider or an insider, because I sort of like face that all the time, because I was born and raised in Sarawak, you know, 17 years of my life. I speak Kayan, I sort of speak Iban, and I'm very much in touch with my native heritage. But a lot of the times I feel diasporic. Even when I'm home, I feel like I'm diasporic because I didn't grow up in the longhouse. I grew up in the city. I didn't grow up in, you know, the rural areas where my aunts and my cousins all live. I went to an English speaking school. I'm not super fluent in my indigenous languages. And so a lot of the times I feel like an outsider, even though technically I'm an insider, which is just wild to me, because that is Borneo is my homeland. And to feel like there's just so much that goes there's so much that goes into that as well, because if you really want to talk, if anyone's super familiar with Malaysia, Malaysia didn't exist until Borneo joined Malaya, basically. And it's, you know, it's a very troubling relationship we have with West Malaysia. And so a lot of the times our cultures and our languages become sidelined. A lot of us have lost, especially those of us in urban centers, have lost touch with our like heritage and stuff like that, because it has been systematically kind of like pushed out in schooling systems. And like there are only like very few indigenous languages. There are over 29 indigenous languages in Sarawak, not even counting Sabah, which is in North Borneo, that get taught in schools, and that's only in very specific areas as well. So yeah, a lot of the times I feel like an outsider, like like I know very little about our religion and our you know, celebrations and like sort of what goes on behind that, because I didn't grow up in the longhouse. I grew up in the city, which also kind of leads me to my next question, and I think this one is more directed to Jacqueline and myself as insider researchers. To what extent do you consider yourself an insider, and how do you negotiate being both a member of your community and the colonial institutions of academia?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I think both of those are really interesting questions. Actually, similar to Ovi, just regarding the first question around whether I consider myself as an inside researcher, I think there are different levels in which we can understand that. And I think about this in terms of the concept of whakapapa, or ancestral connections, and the different kind of pieces of work that I'm involved in. So, for example, I would consider myself an insider research for this a kind of project that I'm working on, which concerns young Indigenous Māori and housing, right? Because that is literally me and our kind of ethnic grouping and the kind of disparities that we face and which we're engaged in. So they're quite issues that are concerned with our everyday lives. So that I would consider myself as an insider researcher, because as a Māori kind of grouping, right? And our connections to land in place. In another project, I would consider myself as an outsider. Mainly because, for example, we might be working with different tribal groupings, and they're not ones that I have ancestral connections to. Right? I'm from 3 other different tribal groupings, but we're working with another one. So we're just here to support, you know, whatever their aspirations and objectives are. And I don't have any, you know, I might have relationships with those, you know, with those tribal groupings, and generally that's kind of how it works. But I do not have ancestral connections to their lands and their place, or the cultural institutions in which they're set up in their village or their settlement. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting dynamic to work in, only because, again, high proportion of my work is working with Māori communities. So I think there's different layers as well, depending on which level that you're working in. Then perhaps if I am working with my own tribal group, which I have not yet, and even then, when working with your own people can always be interesting, and I'm sure many other Māori scholars have their own stories. So yeah, I think that varies in terms of being able to identify the positionality of, you know, the research and the research, essentially. I think the second question about being a community, or being part of your own community and colonial institutions of academia is so very interesting, and I'm sure many Indigenous scholars who are working within those institutions will have, again, their own lived experiences and stories to share. And I was just thinking, you know, I've been working in institutions just for same thing around 5 years, and so I think the difference is that I've always been quite protected. So for me, cultural safety is huge, and being able to, we don't work and operate in isolation, right? We are bound and we are connected. And part of the kind of, I guess, process, or in terms of our own kind of practices, the tuakana and taina relationship, where, you know, the elder or the advanced researcher who tends to be Māori, safeguards and that kind of reciprocal relationship. I've always had that. I've always had strong Māori mentors within the institutions that I've worked in. So I have always ensured that wherever I go, I am protected. And even more so, as you mentioned, I work in Ngā Waia Te Tui Māori and Indigenous Research Centre, but I also teach in architecture schools, which are not Māori. Not enough, and so I'm really lucky that I have that as my safe place, where I'm protected by phenomenal Indigenous Māori scholars from across Aotearoa, and knowing that we have that support, the emotional, the cultural support there is really important. And so many other emerging professionals haven't had that luxury, and there's, for those who are quite familiar, it's quite topical as well, and the trouble that we face as Indigenous scholars in the academy. It's not safe for many, and actually for many seniors as well. Many professors, and I don't want to name institutions here because I know this is recorded, but even their roles, they could be profound scholars and still be dismissed. So yeah, I think that would probably be the most important thing for me, cultural safety and protection within those institutions, because that is how I ground myself and ensures that, the work that we do is of integrity and is anchored in, the many values and principles that we share. So then that's non-negotiable, as in terms of the work that we do. So again, different layers, but ensuring that those safety nets are really important. So yeah, a tricky place to navigate. Sometimes I hate it, realistically in architecture. There are not many Māori educators. Actually, there's probably maybe 10 max across the country. And I teach in 2 different architecture schools. And that's hard. It's hard, but it's a place of transformation and change as well. And for many Māori scholars have come through that system. So I think we also have a role and responsibility as well within those institutions. So yeah, bit of a interesting kind of conversation. And I'm sure you could just spend one whole session on just that question. So yeah, hopefully that's just kind of an overview.
I completely feel that, because it's like a lot of the people doing research on Borneo are not even Bornean. And it's hard because it's like there are a lot of very fascinating research coming out about Indigenous Borneo from Indigenous Borneans, but a lot of it happens to be from, if not, Malaysians, at least outsiders from who aren't even Malaysian. And it's like I hold a lot of these scholars in respect, because there's not a lot of work out there on Borneo. Especially on like this very niche thing that I've decided to do. It's hard enough being a native Malaysian scholar, let alone being a queer Malaysian scholar. So I completely feel that. And the reason I asked this question is because last year I read this really scathing anthropology paper, basically calling out, I don't want to use the word hypocrisy, but I'm going to use it. Hypocrisy of post-colonial and Indigenous scholars. And it was quite a pessimistic paper, right? Basically calling out a lot of like post-colonial scholars for acting like colonizers, extracting data for their own benefit. Because like, when you really think about it, for a lot of us, not for all of us, but for a lot of us, a lot of our work very rarely, if ever, goes back into the community and serves the social and material transformations that we aim to serve. And a lot of the times we conduct this research and it ends up benefiting our own careers, or it ends up staying within the colonial metropoles. And reading that paper, I had this massive existential crisis of like, why am I even here? Why am I doing this? And I was like this close to quitting. I mean, I'm still kind of on the fence, but like, don't tell my supervisor that. But he was also kind of optimistic, right? He offers a strategy, and I wanted to bring this up. And he called it the interstitial passage, right? Whereas it's this idea of having your foot in both doors to kind of navigate the tensions of being an Indigenous person as well as a member of colonial institutions of academia. right? This like having to acknowledge that even though you are a member of the community, you are working from a place of privilege, and you kind of always have to acknowledge that position you have and that power dynamic as you carry on with your research. And I was thinking back to Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, and she talks about one of the most important things about Indigenous research strategies is this idea that communal relationships are above everything else, including your findings. And you have, as an Indigenous researcher, you have a responsibility to your community before everything else. And I found that it was such a interesting and tangible way, I guess, to kind of look at what it means to sort of work with an interstitial passage. And that book is my Bible. I live by it every day. Yeah. So yeah, it's like what you said. I could have an entire Q&A's like panel discussion, just this one thing. But it is something that like that keeps me up at night with everything I do, which sort of like leads me to my next question, and anyone can feel free to answer this. How do you make sure your research goes back to the community?
I could probably just speak to some of that briefly. There's actually the community involved in the research, so I think about the ways in which we work with communities. And we'll speak to some of this later, but we resource them time. Actually, they are part of the research team. And so as part of the kind of methodological process, they have also a role and responsibility back to whether they're trust or other cultural institutions in their communities that we work in like an ecosystem essentially, right, as the core kind of research team. But as well, we because we've partnered, they go back, and so it's kind of part of that kind of reciprocal process and the way in which I guess they speak to around the transmission of knowledge and findings and sharing. So it's just inherently part of the process as well, and that might come in different forms, whether it's through creative outputs, other kind of publications that are not journal articles that none of the community are going to read. Again, another session that you could talk about, or they don't even have access to, and so those types of things, being able to provide, as opposed to the way in which we traditionally do go to conferences, actually it's held within the community, and so just being able to challenge mainstream thinking and processes which are embedded in communities, but when they're a part of it, it just becomes a part of the kind of normalized process. So yeah, working alongside them essentially, and with them and for them. So, again, comes back to that kaupapa Māori framework, and again, which is in the same book that you're talking about in terms of decolonizing methodology. So yeah, just normalize the process, and that it is not extractive, that it is not exploitive. And again, thinking about who the research serves and the community that it serves.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to add to that?
I could sort of, I was really interested by the word extractive. Jacqueline, I thought was really interesting. And obviously archaeology is seen as the ultimate extractive discipline, I think, and very destructive in its methodologies. And one thing that I've become extremely interested in, particularly after reading the PhD thesis of Erna Lilja, but also work by people like James Flexner and Torrance and Clark, is the idea of the museum as an archaeological site. And so I've been quite interested in terms of the depositional process of how taonga or other entities from Moana Oceania have entered museums in places like Europe and the Americas, and how sometimes there are processes of forgetting that are akin to them being buried, and then how one can sort of locate them again in a sort of archaeological sense. Sometimes the taonga that I'm working with are mislabeled. it's very difficult to figure out what they are for me. So I spend a lot of time looking at them from a sort of physical viewpoint and comparing them with other items. And then how you try and communicate that research back to a community that they've been divorced from for a very long period of time. So instead of going to, obviously I've been to communities and lived with communities and done archaeological survey in areas, but it's also really interesting when the archaeological site itself is far away from the community. And the last time I took information back to a community about that kind of thing, I took a sort of display. So I got permission from the museums to take information, in this case photographs, back to the community, and then sort of surveyed the community and asked them what they'd be interested in the future, and talked to them about the fact that these sort of items are overseas. So I just wanted to say that from an archaeological perspective, that we're starting to think about different ways in which we can bring information back to people. And is it okay to always be extracting things out of somewhere where people already know they are? Or is it in some ways good to reverse that process and bring information back and work with people in that sort of regard? Sorry, I talked a bit long then, but I hope that was interesting, just to see archaeology maybe in a slightly different light, or at least its potential to be less extractive and more giving.
Absolutely. Ovi, do you have anything else to add?
I think anthropology is kind of an obscure skill, like for archaeology and architecture, you can contribute in terms of tangible thing. You can do things. So I don't know, Ash, what do you think, like as an anthropology, you basically, observe people and then you think about it, right? And people are not really benefited from it, to be honest, right? So what can I say, maybe from my experience on field, like doing research on Sumba Island for 18 months, what I could do was just, I had to be, I opened up myself, and I was vulnerable. I opened up myself, and being driven by externalities. So it's not only about I have to reach something, I have to get some data, but also I had to be very patient. Plus there was a pandemic as well, so you have to be very vulnerable and not always control everything. So you have to make sure that you work together with your community, like what you said. I mean, so it's not only you who ask questions. So if they want to ask questions to you, you have to, I think I need to open up as well. So I also give my time for them anytime they want, to say things or tell their stories not related to my research. I think it's one of the ways to become, a person in a community, not only to give something tangible, but also to give your time and also grow together with them. And also on the field, I don't have any great skills other than being an academic. So, but once I debated competitively, so I offered one of the youth clubs to teach them, how to do competitive debating, but they declined that. But then I also help like some local NGOs to translate things or to make, proposal for funding. But yeah, I try my best to just be a friend and also useful for the community where I lived in. So that's from my experience from my field works. But I don't know in the future when I have graduated and have more experience like Helen and Jacqueline, I have to think more about how to contribute to the local communities in more in greater level. Yeah, I think so.
The thing you said about like, anthropologists and sociologists, all we do is go into the field and think. That is that is so true, because it's like I think about that all the time. It's like, okay, so I've written an entire paper on like queer and Indigenous time and its implications for like development in Malaysia. What now? Do you know what I mean? Like, is a government official going to read that? Probably not. Are they going to take me seriously? I don't think so. And, you know, I think about this all the time, and I always go back to this idea of like cultivating knowledge. You know, if I can't do anything tangible, at the very least, what I can do is like one, what you said, you know, be respectful of the relationships I form with the people in my community and understand my responsibility to them, you know, but also like making, if I can't do anything else, at least all like what I can do is cultivate knowledge and then disseminate it back to the community in ways that they can then use it for things like, I guess, like, I don't know, I'm thinking back to the like those revolutionary times where people are passing around pamphlets and stuff like that, you know, I don't know, maybe an infographic, but creating knowledge that can be used, that is that they can then take with them and try and figure out, you know, what we can then, you know, I guess how we can make Borneo a better place for people, you know, for queer dyads, you know. Yeah, it's like, it's a very tricky thing where it's like, I can't necessarily build a building or decolonize a museum directly, but so yeah, like it's tricky. I don't really have an answer for that. But yeah, I guess it's something that like, it's a challenge that I'm gonna have to like work through as I progress with my research journey. I think we have time left for 2 more questions. So what I want to ask, this is related to what Jacqueline talked about earlier about making sure the community is involved, is how do you, I guess, negotiate co-authorship practices and collaboration? Who would like to start first?
Well, I've never been in a position where I need to negotiate it yet, but I've offered some collaborations on the field, and many people accepted, but I got rejected as well by researchers who are doing research on Sumba Island, although they were not doing like doctoral research. But this is very shocking for me, you know, because as a first-time researcher, I thought, you know, people are very collaborative and etc. But yeah, it's sometimes when you offer yourself, and I'm very open for collaboration, and sometimes when you offer yourself, you know, some people just afraid that you will go to their source of data or talk to people that they've met or other kind of things like that. Although I think in anthropology and sociology, findings have different interpretations, right? So I don't think anything can be stolen from, you know, from something, right? Yeah. So
I guess what I mean is more so like collaboration with like the communities you're researching. And so like, again, like I think I mentioned this prior, I'm trying to make sure, even though I'm an autoethnographer, I'm trying to make sure that my practice and my strategy is collaborative, right? But at the same time, how do you then cite the people that have basically embedded your ability to create the thing, you know, your thesis or your paper? And that's hard, especially because I also do, like, I don't just do Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous work, I also do queer theory, queer of color critique. And that's hard because I also have to make sure that like my collaborators remain anonymous for their own safety, because for those of you who don't know, it is illegal to be gay in Malaysia. So like citation becomes tricky, right? And I brought up maybe like potentially having an et al. If I ever do publish in the future, having like an et al. At the back. And then I talked about like, could I do this with my PhD, potentially like having my name followed by an et al. To sort of reference or give respect to the people who I'm collaborating with. But yeah, that's sort of what I have sort of thought about recently. I don't know about the other, about you guys.
I have not co-authored with a huge amount of people. I haven't written a huge amount of publications. I'm an early career researcher, but I was really fortunate to have a sort of, as Jacqueline said, like a tuakana taina sort of relationship, friendship with a particular researcher who included me on a co-authored publication, along with someone who would be considered to be a community member who's extremely knowledgeable and an expert, and that sort of, along with a bunch of other people as well. And so that process was really important to me and has really guided sort of me in thinking about how one thinks about community-based research in that way. I think that sometimes, in this sort of anthropological sense, sometimes we think of people as being informants, and I don't think we should. I think we need to recognize the fact that they're an expert, and potentially far more of an expert than we are, like unbelievably more, and they should be recognized as such on academic papers. And so I think that that's the future, is moving towards that. And I don't know what that means, Ash, to put a question back to you. In anthropology, what happens when your informants are co-authors, and what happens to that relationship? Because, for example, if you're doing some kinds of, actually, hang on, I'm so sorry, you're a sociologist, aren't you? I'm so sorry, Ash, it's so awful. Ovi, I should have directed it at you. But with you both, when you're interviewing a lot of people, maybe hundreds of people, how do you negotiate that? Do you just have hundreds of co-authors? Do you make it very sort of obvious that you are asking people what they think, but you acknowledge them very heavily? How do you deal with it? Sorry.
I think about this all the time, because it's like, you can't write a research paper without people, you know, as a social scientist, because without their data, you wouldn't have anything. And they are essentially co-authors. And I guess that's like one of the biggest challenges that I'm facing as a collaborative researcher, is knowing when and how to cite. And I think someone in the geography department last year talked about how sometimes, again, you have to go back to the community and ask them, sometimes it's just as simple as going back to the community and asking them, do you want to be cited in this? And, you know, when she said that, I was like, it can't possibly be that easy. But like, sometimes I don't know, I guess it is just a matter of like making sure you give the community what they need and what they want, you know, and making sure that they're directing everything. Because again, without them, you will have nothing to show for. But yeah, it's tricky, especially with like the work I'm doing, where like citation isn't necessarily possible for safety reasons. And again, like, I really want to be edgy and just put an et al in my PhD thesis. Just be like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? But yeah, Jacqueline, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer this, only because the different contexts. So majority of the things that I have published have been all with other Māori scholars, but they're quite specialized in certain areas, as opposed to the significant kind of community-based stuff that I've been working in. And thinking about it, I've only published with non-Māori once. So I think it varies. So for me, that, you know, that's really probably important. The second one, and I'm thinking about some of the publishing strategies that we've drafted as well, and other kind of learnings from other scholars. And I know this is recorded, so I just want to be really careful. And how some scholars, Indigenous scholars, in order to finesse the system of the academy, will list everybody, right? To be really smart, given the institutions that we work in, around deliverables and, you know, citations, we'll name everybody, the entire whole research team, right? And there could be 10 plus, you know, authors. So I find that quite interesting. And it's actually about collectivism within that as well, as opposed to kind of this individualistic kind of way of working, and recognition of everyone's contribution to the project. So I find that quite interesting in itself. I've never done anything like that as of yet. And then I'm thinking about the many different outputs and deliverables of projects. So I might write something really specialist, but then the other community members in the project, depending on where they will publish, they might be lead. And then, so there's always some like type of order, and it varies as well. Obviously, it could be one who leads it, and the last might be like the science lead or the other types of project leaders on the project. So that varies, and then we have other discussions around the lead and then alphabetical order. And so there's different strategies, and I don't think there's one way as well. And I guess it depends, because and this is me being extremely naive, and that's because I don't care as much about, like, for me, that is not the research impact that I am, you know, and I speak about this around the service to our communities. I'm sorry, but the communities that I work are not going to read these journals or these conference papers. And that language is a huge barrier, right? And it creates all these other challenges. And I've still maintained this naivety for a long time, and someone can correct me later. But I just, and perhaps it's just the way in which we work. And I'm just, who does it serve other than the institutions that we work with? And unless you're trying to climb the ladder in the academy, you know, and that's not really the change that I essentially want to make. So I think it varies in terms of, you know, citations and stuff like that. I mean, I'm always trying to address knowledge gaps, right? So so being really strategic around that is probably far more important than the high journal that you got into, which is really great for many, of course, and our students need that. But again, it just varies in terms of capacity and capability as well. So long way to go for me. So I don't really know how to kind of answer that. And it just varies in terms of context.
Yeah, no, I think like the thing you mentioned, actually, like I've been like in my head a lot about like, how do I make sure that I cite the people I research and like my communities? And then when I really think about it, like, yeah, are they gonna read this? Like, is that what's gonna like serve their like interest? I didn't think about that like that until very recently, but that's interesting. I'm gonna think more about that, actually. And I guess this leads us to our last question before I move on to audience Q&A. When does research end? Who would like to start first?
I think I could just answer in short. I mean, contractually, I'm sure there's an end, depending on the lens that you bring. But if we think about it and really understand the importance of relationships above everything, those never really end, right? And they always become reciprocal and long-term. So I don't think research ever ends. And I think we always think about other opportunities to kind of build on, but those relationships tend to always be maintained. So yeah, that's for me. They don't really end.
Yeah, I sort of like take the same stance. It's like, yeah, like I may have published the paper, but like, because like when I really think about it, I'm also kind of still friends with people I've like researched, you know, because these are relationships you form in the field. I use that term loosely. Yeah, like, you know, we will always have a responsibility to the communities we research even after we publish, and that's never going to go away, you know. Yeah, Ovi, what do you think?
I agree with Jacqueline. Yeah, I'm not sure either. Yeah.
Helen?
Yeah, I obviously totally agree. I think it's amazing how these transcend, you know, talking about collectivism, transcend individuals as well. So I've done a little bit of work in museums and sort of was a curator at one for a couple of years. And I am super interested in the fact that these can span decades. They can span individual curators and collections managers and things. They, in different leaders in different communities, to being enduring relationships that are often mediated through taonga or other sort of entities that live in the museums. And it's a really important thing to realize that even after us, there will be continued relationships if we're working within groups and also with those groups in the communities. So, yeah.
And also the idea that like your research technically kind of lives on forever. Like you may have published a paper, but then someone's going to read that and then expand on it, you know, like it never, like it's like a chain effect. Like it never really stops. And I often think about my own work on like queer indigeneity in Borneo. Like no one's ever really done something like that, you know? And I'm not saying that to like make myself like, oh, look at me, I'm doing the first one. Like, no, absolutely not. But like, I think about like, okay, so I let's say I published a paper on like queer indigeneity in Borneo. And it's something that's that's not really talked about, hasn't really been written about. Someone is going to take that and then expand on it. And so like research then never really stops. You know what I mean? It just will keep on going. And your research will live on forever, and your relationships with your interlocutors, for lack of a better term, will still live on as well. So I guess that brings an end to the panel section. So I think we will move on to audience Q&A. Sorry, let me just, whoops. This is just a reminder that if you want to stay anonymous, you can send a message directly to the ISDG chat. But if you would like to ask a question, feel free to put something in, type it out in the chat, or unmute yourself. I think Judith, you can help out with that. So yeah, we have a question in the chat. What is your advice to someone who is non-Indigenous to approach this kind of research framework in a culturally relevant way? I'm a researcher working in Canada on topics regarding child safety, and our next project follows a community-based participatory action research framework, including Indigenous communities, among other equity-seeking communities. Does anybody have sort of a response to that? That's interesting. Yeah. I'm not really sure if I have like a tangible answer to that. But I guess like making sure that like the community is at the forefront of your research, I think is a good place to start. Right, yeah. Does anybody have any kind of responses to this question?
Sorry, because we live in, apparently our house is a nursery, the light turned on, so I needed to move. So I'm just trying to catch up with the question, and I'm wondering if there's any more context. Is this for your own research, or is there an opportunity to partner, to work alongside some of the community? Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, could someone like help unmute her?
Hi. Thank you so much. I mean, you know, I'm honored to be able to attend such a webinar. It's like the richness of knowledge, all what you have done. My concern is that, and this is part of like a bigger project, and even though it is in Canada, like Indigenous, they don't have borders, right? So like it's everywhere. And I say they because I am not Indigenous. So I just want to approach the, you know, the project in a very culturally relevant way. Having said that, on our team, we have many researchers who are Indigenous and who are going to introduce us to the community. And I think they know what they're doing, but I don't know what I'm doing. So part of me attending this session is to understand how can I approach the research from my perspective and my biases. As you have said, you know, we cannot like, you know, mitigate all the biases. How can I approach that in a culturally relevant way to help the team make the best out of this experience? And just to say, like, all the deliverables, everything is community related, and it is focused on what they want and not on what we like from their lens and not from our lens. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you. That's really helpful to understand. And actually what I would really love to recognize, firstly, how you identified your positionality, right, in relation to the community in which you seek to, because actually that's not as common as well. So I think that's firstly, just want to acknowledge that. I think it's really great to hear that, you know, you're in the process of establishing these relationships. So that is where I would start, and with your team already on it, and just thinking about, you know, the opportunities to partner, thinking about the power, you know, the power balances within the team and the opportunities for the communities that you're working with to be able to resource, you know, how might they be involved in the research? What are some of the kind of partnership opportunities, I think, will be fundamental in terms of really reflecting and demonstrating some of the collaborative processes on which you know, seek to understand. And through that relationship and that partnership, thinking about some of the kind of really values and principle-based approach to this in terms of working together, and really setting that strong foundation in terms of the working relationship, being really transparent and honest around, you know, some of the other technicalities of the project in which you need to deliver, and how can you transform the ways in which you're working, you know, outside of the traditional ways, and how is it tailored to suit that community, will be really important. I think also just listening, which is something that I don't think we do enough of sometimes, is just listen to the communities, the stories, their narratives, understand the importance of their connections to place, and some are just the fundamentals, I think, because that will inform, or it should inform anyway, your kind of research framework, which is culturally responsive and relevant to the way in which you work. So really just ensuring that it is anchored in that, and not going in with this kind of preconceived way of how we should work. This is what we're going to do, and we're going to impose all of these, you know, ABC. Be really open-minded to being able to adapt to, and being really flexible to these ways of working, and find that common ground as well. So I think those are some tools that I would suggest as well, and really kind of understanding, you know, the historic, you know, all the basics, to really build up your own knowledge as well, so that it is supplemented by just what they're contributing. So hopefully that's really helpful. I think it's really awesome that you're thinking about, you know, doing this piece of work, and I know that you're speaking about kind of the notion of equity. What does that mean, right? And how does this work address, you know, these inequities? So I think this is, you know, not a logical, you know, or a linear process, but I think just some of those kind of things hopefully might help you in terms of the engagement.
Thank you so much.
I want to add a bit. So before I went to Sumba, I read a lot about Sumba, about that place, a lot of books about it. And then other than formal sources, I also inundate myself with informal media, like social media, and also news about that local area, and also try to know people informally as friends as well, because sometimes these informal channels can inform you more about what is happening right now compared to like books that were published 20 years ago. And I think it's a nice way to, you know, to see people in their contemporary languages, to know what their contemporary issues are. So we don't really see them merely as an indigenous community, but they're also humans who are thinking about international relations, and also maybe thinking about the same issues as you are. So like what Jacqueline said, perhaps finding some similarities or similar grounds would be very helpful as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you for suggesting the book about decolonizing methodologies. I think this is where I should start my readings.
You're welcome. It's a really good book. Like,
thank you.
Basically changed my life. Does anybody else have any other questions from the audience? No one's raising hands. Well, I guess if we don't have any more questions coming from the audience, Leanne, has anyone sent any messages to you on the ISDG chat personally?
There was just that one that was sent to the group chat, but if you don't mind, I'd just like to follow up on a bit of a question here. That I know a lot of students and colleagues as well have been thinking about during the pandemic, and obviously that's still something that's ongoing, and that different parts of the world have different rules and restrictions and travel restrictions and all of these things that will be ongoing, you know, for this year and perhaps longer than that. So I'm just wondering to the speakers about how to not just start research projects in a time like this and start those kind of relationships, but how do you work on maintaining those, especially when, again, there may be these restrictions in terms of traveling or getting to communities, or even when there's hesitancy in terms of like health and safety, like even if restrictions have sort of been tampered down because of decreases in cases, sometimes there is still differences in comfort levels and things like that. So just wondering how to maintain those relationships and work with communities in sort of unprecedented, difficult times. I'm just wondering if any of you have had any experience over the past couple of years or any advice on that.
I'm actually glad you asked that question, because blasphemous, I know, but I'm going to be doing online research mainly. For like a variety of reasons. The pandemic is one of them, but also for safety reasons. It's kind of difficult to conduct queer research in person in Malaysia, you know. So like moving everything online is, you know, in my opinion, like a safer choice. Sort of gives people the power to like decide, you know, how they want to go about participating in the research. But yeah, so as someone who is planning on conducting online research, pandemic or not, I guess for me, I'm in a very like interesting position, because a lot of like the queer dayaks I know are very chronically online. Like we're all on Twitter, just like, you know, doing our thing. And so like forming those like relationships online, I guess again, it's also very much a generational thing. Like establishing rapport online is something that that a lot of, like, it doesn't, I guess it comes kind of like naturally to a lot of us, I guess, who are already online to begin with. But like things like going on doing a video call, or like exchanging emails, or like chatting and like sort of relating, finding sort of common ground to talk about, and letting them know that you're not just a researcher, you're a human being, and letting them know that like that we're on the same level. Do you know what I mean? And always like reassuring them that like, you know, I can't do this research without you, so you know, it doesn't make me superior in any way. And trying to find ways to relate with them as people, even if it's through a screen, you know. I guess that becomes more of a challenge when you are researching, I guess, like communities that are very rural, who don't really have access to things like the internet. That's sort of when it becomes even more challenging. So I wouldn't have an answer for that, but if you happen to be researching like young urban natives, I guess it's a very idiosyncratic thing for me. But Ovi, I think you did research during the pandemic, did you?
Yes, the pandemic happened like several months after I was on the field. It was so stressful because no one knows what happens. No one knows how to mitigate that. What should we do and everything? And then government of Indonesia closed their airports, their regional airports in all of the provinces. So basically you couldn't move. And then basically, you know, you ask your supervisors, of course, like they don't know what should they do until the WHO said that this is clearly a pandemic. So, and then basically just prioritize your health and everything like that. So what I did back then was that I was so scared of the virus because there was no vaccination yet. And then because, you know, people died in Italy, in China and everything. And then I digested that news on the field on Sumba Island. And then what I did was I moved to online, like, you know, interviewing my friends online for 2.5 months. So I think you're going to do this, right, Ash? So what I find it very interesting is because I have talked to them before the pandemic, And before that, I talked to them in, for example, in a cafe or in observation, in rituals, basically in public space. And sometimes they got a bit conscious about it because people can see them. And basically it's a small town. So people will say, oh, Ovi just met this. And then, you know, Ovi, the person that you met just met this one and he's not a very good person, you know, like this kind of thing circulates, you know, everyone knows everyone. But then when you move into an online platform, what is interesting for me is like, it's like a confessional for them. Sometimes I can get like lengthy conversation about it, and I can focus on this one person, and it is, I think it is also very enriching. So I think researchers need to also embrace that and not to think online as something that is, you know, as something that is not important, because I think it's very interesting. And what is interesting, my friends in one of the youth collectives, they are making this first conference of all Marapu religion leaders, like ancestral religion leaders, because they couldn't make it in person because of the pandemic. They make it online with Zoom with all of the ancestral religion priests. And what they did was each of them went to each village to provide like Wi-Fi for the priests who are usually old, you know. So there's still movement offline, but you try to connect these people online. But like, yeah, but still I think meeting people offline and observing them in person is just a very, very different way of researching and of experiencing being on the field. Yeah.
That thing you said about like everyone knows everyone is precisely why I decided not to do research in the Longhouse. I don't want some auntie like spreading rumors about anybody. And we have a question from the chat. Okay, I think everyone here has heard this question before, like in a pre-panel meeting. But what do you consider was the biggest mistake in your research, and what did you take away from it? Well, I haven't started my research yet, so I guess, what do you guys think?
I would say that mine is definitely, in some instances, not being proficient in the language where I was going. It's an enormous mistake. It's a real problem to expect people to speak English with me. And yeah, that's what I would say, that's an enormous problem. And it really is very difficult from an ideological perspective as well, to understand a culture and to be writing archaeology about that culture and not understand on a fundamental level how they're talking about it in their own language. So
I'm not really sure about mistake, maybe learnings. And what I find actually really challenging is working with non-Māori. Actually, I find it really difficult, who don't really have the cultural understanding, right? And so actually I think that's probably one of the biggest learnings, is jumping into a project with someone you don't actually have a strong relationship with. It's a huge risk as well. I'm being quite aware of that. So yeah, probably that.
Ovi?
I just wish I started quicker and faster, and being more forward about my research. Because interestingly, people on Sumbayan, or people that I encountered, they said that, like, don't be afraid to, you know, to take pictures or to be in front of the stage and then ask people around, like, be aggressive about it, because that's what researchers do. That's what they said. So, because like what you said, I mean, I try to be very patient and very careful about it. It took me like a long time to gather some data, but if I could do it again, considering the pandemic and etc., I think I would like to do it more assertively, I think.
Right. Well, I guess that's it for all the questions. So in closing, I would like to thank our speakers, Jacqueline, Ovi, and Helen today. It has truly been an honor to host you here, and it has been a profound learning experience for me, and I'm certain for our audience as well. We can take a lot of the knowledge and experience shared here today back to our own context and hopefully put it to good work. We would like to thank our audience for taking the time to join us and sharing their questions. And please keep an eye out on our website and YouTube channel, where we will be sharing the recording of today's event. And to learn more about our upcoming events and to register for them, please visit our CRASSH webpage and the links will be posted in the chat. To get involved or give us feedback and suggestions for future events, write to us at the email IDs posted in the chat. Yes. So thank you everyone for coming today. This has been a great event and I will be ending the recording now. Yes.